Well, terrific. Thank you very much, and good day, everyone, wherever you're calling in from. Good. Looks like we got about 80 folks on the call, which is terrific, and thank you for answering those poll questions. And as we go through this, to the extent we can make this interactive through you typing in into the chat, we'll try to keep track of those. And if something is not clear, please kind of put up your hand and make sure that we address it at the time. But otherwise, we'll try to hold most of the questions till we are at the end of this. So I'm Norm Barber, Managing Director at Unified Cloud. I've been at IT now for, well, over 30 years, and a lot of it in the last number of years has been involved with cloud migration, and areas of cost management, security, and compliance are the areas that I've been practicing in. And what I want to do is, first of all, thank Pragmatic Works for the opportunity to participate in this education series. There's a lot going on in the cloud, and we certainly want to make sure that we address those. Okay, so great. Laptop is working. So a little background on us. So I said we are been at this for quite some time. The principals in our firm are all ex-Microsoft engineers. I will tell you straight out that our focus tends to be on Azure and Azure migration. The lessons learned today have come from that set of experience, but I think it's fair to say that those of you who are either on AWS or some other platform or considering other platforms, much of what we will discuss today is applicable regardless of platform, but it's a sort of a caveat. There is a lot you'll see in here regarding the Azure platform. As I said, we are focused on what I call the 4 C's: cloud, cybersecurity, compliance, and cost. We provide tools to partners like Pragmatic Works, and we have resources here in the US and our Development and Operations Center in Noida, India. We are a Microsoft Go partner for our solutions, and you'll see us refer to the Cloud Atlas Suite throughout this. I think what's important to set from the beginning is this is not meant to be a sales pitch. It really is meant to be an educational discussion around the lessons we've learned in doing this work for a number of years and developing the tools we have, but you'll see some reference to the various Cloud Atlas tools throughout. Importantly, we partner with Microsoft directly, in addition to our partnership with Pragmatic Works, in a number of areas. And of particular importance is that we are an Azure Migrate partner, and Microsoft, working with a partner ecosystem, has developed an approach that we will draw from today. It's called the Azure Migrate program, and you'll see that as we get into the details here. One of the things that we learned when we were in the engineering team at Microsoft in the early stages of, well, back in the day, we called it Red Dog, which was before it became Azure. As we started to talk to Microsoft's major customers about this notion of cloud, we found that no one was going to be able to just jump to the cloud. There needed to be a series of, I'll call them get ready steps that moved organizations into a cloud environment, whether that's full cloud or more likely a hybrid cloud environment where you've got something still on-prem and other things, storage perhaps, or some compute capabilities, maybe even identity and access management sitting in cloud environments. But we've broken it down into these 3 stages: discover and assess, target and migrate, and monitor and optimize. The interesting thing about the cloud, and you're going to see a reference in a little bit to the number of updates Azure has created over a one-year period. And this is typical of all vendors in the cloud space. They are making enhancements because they can slipstream those capabilities into the cloud very, very quickly. And so you can find major releases and feature level releases as an ongoing stream. And we estimated once that every 4.16 hours, some type of feature level change happens in, let's say, the Azure environment. True, I think also of AWS or Rackspace or IBM or any of them. So the notion of monitor and optimize, this is definitely not a once and done experience. We've had some organizations say, yeah, but I'm a data center guy, and once I move to the cloud, my job is over. I would argue your job is just beginning, and it gets really interesting. And I think that'll jump out at you as we go through this. So that's kind of who we are. So let's talk about the agenda. What I'd like to do is just kind of level set with a few slides that get into definitions. And I like to use the NIST definitions of these environments because I think it helps clarify what comes with what kind of environment. And there are three: software as a service, infrastructure as a service, and platform as a service. And we'll define those and take a look at those. Secondly, I want to spend some time thinking through or exploring with you the real drivers of cloud migration, and a lot of discussion around innovation and agility and those kinds of things, but I think you'll see from the discussion we'll have, cost is still the number one driver, and I think for good reason. So we'll explore that. Then we'll dive down into this three-step approach for cloud migration, and we'll drill down a level or two in that. One of the things that I like to do in these kinds of programs is sort of tell you things that you need to know as you think about the stages of cloud migration. You'll see references to our tool set, and as I said, it's less to give you feature level cool stuff in the Cloud Atlas tools as much as we've built certain things into our analytics for specific reasons, and it's the specific reasons I want to spend time talking about, because those are the questions you need to ask of your consulting or your SI like Pragmatic Works, or hope to get out of tools like ours. But however you decide to do this, since many of you are at the early stages, these are things you need to know along the way. So that's our agenda. So let's start with what do we mean by these different levels. And on the left here, you see, if I'll call it the traditional on-premise world, things that you as the IT organization are responsible for. Much of what you'd expect. You'd expect to be responsible for the underlying networking of your infrastructure and the various forms of storage, whether it's Oracle or SQL. Servers could be a host of different servers, could be Microsoft Windows servers, or could be Linux. You could be using VMware or Microsoft VMs to leverage your investment in physical servers. Obviously, you are responsible in this environment for your OS and keeping those operating systems. We like to recommend current no later than 2. So you're going to be thinking about, in your current environment, moving it to the latest SQL and latest Windows environments or the latest Linux environments. You're going to be responsible for any middleware or runtime technologies that you have that's running on that infrastructure. You for sure will be responsible for data. If you are dealing with with the EU and what you sell through websites and so forth. You're going to be thinking about the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, that begins enforcement this year in April. So you're going to be responsible for data, finding it, discovering it, managing it, protecting it. And then applications. You may have source code, or you may be dealing with applications that are where the developer, if it's a custom application, is long gone, and you're just dealing with binaries that you have running on those servers. So that's sort of the typical environment that you would manage. In the cloud world, sort of on the extreme end, you might be using, let's say, Office 365 or Dynamics 365 for sales or finance and operations, or Concur if you're in the HR world. Maybe Salesforce.com. A lot of people are using Salesforce.com, and in that environment, all of those areas of management fall to the SaaS, or the software as a service vendor, and that's kind of a two-state. You're either in the cloud all the way, or you're not in at all. In between, though, are these environments, and this is typical of what you would find in Azure. Infrastructure as a service, some people use the term lift and shift. This is where you basically are moving the VMs that you have, applications, storage, and so forth, moving that to a cloud environment and let the cloud vendor, Microsoft Azure, run what's under the covers in terms of virtualization, servers, storage and networking, that sort of infrastructure that they take off your hands, but the rest of it you're responsible for. Whereas platform as a service, now what we're starting to do is offer to the IT organization ways to do OS and runtime and virtualization and various types of services. And what you're thinking about is just basically applications and data. The term modernizing applications starts to be applied in a PaaS environment. So we have these two environments that we want to talk about today, because you'll see in the data that I'll give you, people have tried to understand which is the migration vector. Am I just going to do lift and shift, or am I going to try to modernize? And the answer is both, and it's how you approach it that is where the success comes. So those are the different environments that we're going to be dealing with. So let's look at some of the scenarios that you would find, let's say, starting with IaaS, infrastructure as a service. It is ideal for test and development environment. So if you've got a lot of development going on, IaaS can be a terrific foundation for DevOps kinds of activities. As if you're looking at lots of storage, particularly backup and recovery storage, using Azure SQL database in a hybrid environment is a terrific scenario to consider if that's kind of the way your IT organization is organized. Then we've got the application lift and shift that I mentioned, which is basically containerizing or putting on VMs your application environment, including the storage that surrounds it, and just literally lifting and shifting it into a cloud environment where it will run, and you'll use perhaps an Azure Active Directory to help with the authentication and access to those applications that are running in an Azure environment. So those are sort of the principal IaaS scenarios. When we get to PaaS, that's where some of this creativity starts to happen. People are developing very cool phone applications and various media services and helping with connected devices, and what we call application modernization. when you look at the side-by-side costs of a PaaS environment versus an IaaS environment, it's much less for, let's say, storage. SQL VM versus Azure SQL database is a very different pricing structure. So there are definite cost advantages to being in a PaaS environment from a run rate standpoint, balanced again against the cost to do modernization. And some applications, for very good reasons, will never be modernized because they're tied to a manufacturing process or some kind of validated system that can't be changed because of FDA regulations or what have you. But for the large set of web applications, modernization is definitely an opportunity. So when we look at these scenarios, Gartner, if you look at some of the research they put out over the recent couple of years, has called platform as a service, and rightfully so, transformational. And we are just at the beginning of that kind of exploration into what's possible in a PaaS environment. And as we say here, it's more than just a collection of, it's not just infrastructure or a version of hosted service. It is a way to decompose the architecture of your application and associated storage and other workloads and utilize cloud delivered services, whether it's networking capability or identity and access management or certain compute capabilities that heretofore you've not been able to come up with on the on-premise world. And it is a sort of a building block approach. There's always a yeah, but how are we going to do that? And what's interesting is when we start to look at some of the studies that are out there, this is from CompTIA a couple of years ago, they looked at organizations, as many of you are probably starting to, if I look back at the voting that you had here, 52% of you are not yet on the cloud. You've probably gotten from the various vendors lots of talk about time to market and agility and just all those kinds of benefits. But at the end of the day, when we sit down with CIOs and we say, you're going to move to the cloud, what's driving it? It's cost. We just recently had a conversation with a $3 billion manufacturing company CIO, and she was very clear. I need to close some data centers. I need to cut my costs. So cost remains an important ingredient. But what's interesting is that organizations don't look at it as just cutting cost. They're looking at it as saying, I've got to save money and put myself in a cloud environment before I can start to do innovation. And that's the 1-2 step that we see in successful cloud migration. It is recognizing there are some great opportunities, as you see in the slide, for agility and time to market and business unit independence and new capabilities and features and new business opportunities, new business processes, but making sure that you've got a handle on the costs to move to the cloud and costs once you get there is the real driver here. This is a study coming out of IDC, and it was interesting that the way they positioned it here with the compound annual growth rate for PaaS would imply that, oh, well, PaaS is the new shiny thing and IaaS is the thing of the past. Actually, this chart now lays out the preferred path of how to migrate successfully to the cloud. That you think about the efficiencies that you will get with a cloud migration and then begin to use PaaS as a way to do the innovation we talked about. In fact, Microsoft did a study, and I think this is publicly available to folks if you want to get a hold of it. It's called the Total Economic Impact of Microsoft Azure PaaS, And basically, they spoke with a series of Microsoft customers who had gone through the experience of moving to IaaS and then starting to utilize PaaS. And you see on the right the kinds of further opportunities beyond the cloud efficiencies that you get from an IaaS platform. So 80% of IT time was saved because now I'm utilizing more of the cloud capabilities that I used to have to build into the application itself. I can decompose that application into some services perhaps that are delivered through a PaaS platform, and that's where you start to pick up the time to market benefit. So the lesson learned here is to get to the cloud quickly, land, optimize, and then begin to innovate. And that's really a key to the three-step process that we'll be talking about. I said we're all out of, I like to say we drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago because we were in the Azure engineering team and we've participated in the growth and development of that, both as a consulting firm and as well as vendors to Microsoft. But I think what Gartner has hit it on the head here with their Magic Quadrant last year, the most recent one, is that what Microsoft provides through Azure and quite frankly its other cloud solutions like Dynamics 365 and now called Microsoft 365, including Office 365, Windows 10, and Enterprise Mobility and Security EMS, is this ability to go in a lot of different directions based on one vendor approach and one set of licensing, which is really a huge benefit as you start to look at all the combinations and permutations that you need to make decisions on as you look at the cloud. So what was interesting in this Business Insider comment here about Microsoft growing faster than Amazon, and for good reason, because it gives its customers lots of ways to move to the cloud, utilize the cloud, innovate, and so we very much, and this methodology is very Azure centric, and we've moved in that direction. And I think our colleagues at Pragmatic Works would agree with this assessment as to why Azure is important and sort of the platform of choice. Let's go back here and talk a little bit more about cost reduction because that is the driver. Do we have a question? I hear an open mic. Nope, thank you. So I don't generally like to overstate the opportunities from a cost standpoint. What you see here is some data that we recently got from Microsoft. And what you see here is that the savings, I'll call them out of the box, about, it's an 88%, maybe a little less, sort of service to service, apples to apples comparison. Where the opportunity is to go below this comes from how you optimize once you get there. Once you look at your infrastructure, you have a set of VMs, and perhaps today you've sized them to make sure that you don't have any downtime. And what we see is some really interesting, when we get into discovery, we see a utilization of current server infrastructure at a very low percentage. What you're able to do, because you're now metering these VMs or other services, is look exactly at what you're utilizing and be able to scale down from larger sized servers to something lower. Same thing with SQL. Perhaps you think everything has to be backed up and redundant, and maybe you've got some DevOps environments that it could be spun down over the weekend. And so there's probably another 25 to 30% savings beyond that 88% number that you can get down to once you've moved and once you start to optimize. And we'll get into that. So let's talk about these three stages. As I said at the outset, there are three of them. The first one is what we call discover and assess. And the point of that is to take a very deep look at what you've deployed in your environment. What VMs, what servers, what storage, what network, what security environment you have, what security solutions do you have deployed, to give you a very deep look at all of the things, all of the technologies you need to make decisions on as to whether you're going to retire them, whether you're going to move them, whether you're going to refactor them down the road. And so, and we'll drill down into this as we go forward here. So the first phase is what I call discover and assess. Behind that, using a set of tools, ours and others, is what we call the target and migrate phase. And that's what we're trying to look at each application, each VM, each workload that needs to be moved, and make decisions on sizing, on what they're connected to, what applications could be moved as containers, as you'll see, or what kind of database. Is blob storage sufficient, or do you need SQL Azure database? Lots of decisions to be made around what makes sense for this mosaic you're about to redo in the cloud. And then finally, and I think is probably the most overlooked phase of this, which is monitor and optimize. Things change. I talked about features at the platform level changing every 4.16 hours. That doesn't mean that any of these platforms, whether it's Rackspace or AWS or Azure, is unstable. What it does mean is that they continue to evolve for competitive reasons, for performance reasons, for all kinds of good engineering reasons. Our friends in building 42 and 43 back in the Microsoft campus, are constantly innovating on behalf of their customers. So this notion of continual health, performance, cost management, optimization, better security, how do we meet requirements like PCI or HIPAA or GDPR? How do we manage all that? And this is the area of real focus for your operations teams. So again, three phases. There are a set of related tools. You'll see us reference in this information that we get out of the first tool we use that we've built, which is called Cloud Recon, which takes in discovery data, as you'll see, and makes some determinations and assessments. Cloud Pilot, that helps with the detailed sort of app level, code block level interrogation of applications. And then finally, what we call Cloud Supervisor, which helps with that optimization effort. So let's kind of just walk through this in some detail. I would say this is a good framework, which we're about to go through, for your cloud migration. It is, I think, very well aligned to the way Pragmatic Works looks at its methodologies to get you to the cloud. So the first phase, as I said, is what we call discover and assess. And there needs to be a set of tools that you use to scan your IT environment. The one that is used probably the most is a tool that is downloadable and free from Microsoft. I believe Pragmatic Works uses this, called the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit, or MAP. It's now at version 9.7. It is continued to be enhanced and managed by Microsoft. We know the team that manages that very well. And it provides inventory information. So what do you have for VMs and physical machines and storage and applications, but also can provide all of the performance metrics that you'll see in a minute are very, very important. So MAP is an important discovery tool. There are other tools on the market. You've probably seen some of those. Mover is one that is a very sophisticated discovery tool that Microsoft is using these days. But you can get lots of really terrific IT discovery data from Flexera, Snow, or System Center, ServiceNow, or Lansweeper. And then what we do, and whether you use our tool or did it manually, you ought to be looking at some things like, what are the VM opportunities, lift and shift opportunities around Windows servers or Linux servers? What are the storage possibilities around SQL? Which databases perhaps are running on old SQL servers? And you need to understand that if you're at 2005 or older, or Windows Server 2003 or older, you've already passed your end of service date, and there may be workloads and storage and databases or applications that are running on that old infrastructure. You need to think about doing something because you've got a potential risk there. And then looking at what we call cloud potential applications. Those are certain kinds of applications that are using .NET in particular, that might be candidates down the road post lift and shift for modernization. And then having some good calculations around what's it going to cost to run these applications. And I'll show you some examples of that. So the first step, discover and assess. And some of the, this is we're going to talk about information you need to know as we go through this. So when you are making decisions about what to move to the cloud and how to size that, the sizing of, let's say, VMs or storage will have a pretty significant impact on what your cost might be. And so what you see here is you want to be able to, by machine, begin to look at their what we call Azure readiness. And that Azure readiness comes from a degree of utilization that suggests that this is sized correctly for the cloud. Or it's got an old OS that may not run particularly well in the cloud. And a detailed sort of performance level, machine by machine assessment. Because at the end of the day, even though we say lift and shift, these VMs will move one at a time, and each VM needs to have decisions made as it goes to the cloud. So utilization, CPU, memory, IOPS, input, output, performance per second are the kinds of characteristics you need to be thinking about. When you come to targeting where to move that, you have some choices, because pricing and latency can vary a little bit depending on which region, Azure region you're in. The sizing will have, as I said, a dramatic impact, direct impact on pricing. And what you see here, listing of list prices, we maintain those list prices on an ongoing basis. So we've got the latest list prices. And then based on the analysis of CPU utilization and so forth, you need to start making decisions around what storage tier. Are you going to use a standard or a premium kind of storage tier, and what that sizing could be because you have, for VMs, you have both service cost as well as storage cost. So you need to be making decisions about that. Some data centers will have certain services available and other data centers perhaps not. So you need to be aware of which services you need, and that helps you decide which region you're going to run your Azure instance in. About app migration, as I said, you want to understand the development platform, and now we are dealing with an analysis at an infrastructure level, not a deep dive. I'll show you in a minute the deep dive analysis you want to be thinking about, but at least now knowing the platform begins to give us a hint as to which of those custom web applications, 293 you see there in the background, could be modernized at some point and get us to the 44 cloud potential applications. Because what that tells you as you look at your migration strategy is how big a optimization effort you may have down the road. So understanding something about your applications at this point in your migration is important. Then fine-tuning costs. You will find that consultants or tool vendors like Pragmatic and Unified Cloud, we have our professional opinions about, based on our experience, on what you ought to be thinking about. But at the end of the day, these are your decisions to make. And having the ability to do some what-if analysis, again, however you decide to do this, whether you do it on a spreadsheet or use a tool or whatever, you need to be able to look at, I'll call it the degree of separation between what you feel comfortable with and what you're hearing as recommendations from the SI or the tool vendor that you're working with. You may find that, let's say, you believe that you need to have 4 nines of availability, and for good reason. But it may turn out that that's only on a few VMs, and maybe you'd be better off with 3 nines, and you can begin to tailor that, and you'll see that your cost structure starts to change. So having a way to do some fine-tuning, some what-if analysis should be part of your work at this stage of migration. So that's what you need to know about fine-tuning costs. This is an example from a recent engagement. And what you see here, and this is why making decisions around availability is important, because you see here their storage cost and VM running cost at maximum utilizations around $19,000, almost $20,000 per month, based on their licensing opportunities with Microsoft. Now we've basically doubled it because they said we need to have 4 nines availability, which creates a certain set of replication requirements. So your operational and management decisions at this point of your migration can have a pretty dramatic impact on your cost estimate. And what we tell our clients is, play with this data a little bit, because you may be looking at more capacity, more availability than perhaps you need, and quite frankly, you may even have today, and thinking, wow, the cloud doesn't really offer me that much opportunity. Well, sure it does, but you can be a bit of a kid in a candy store sometimes, because you can have 4 nines of availability from Azure, and you can have everything run as a production machine, even if it's a dev test machine. So at this point, even though optimization happens further on, having a good sense of costs, both in the VM level and the various security and networking requirements. So those are all important elements of your business case. So at the end of the discover and assess phase, you would have a strategic document that would say, here are on-prem costs, here are our estimated run costs moving to Azure and what it's going to cost us generally to migrate. And now you have some opportunities in terms of how you migrate. One of them is to start containerizing certain applications that may make sense. And what you need to know about app migration at this point is what is the cost of the infrastructure and associated storage for containerization from a straight lift and shift with VMs, and what if I really wanted to modernize this application? What would be my cost? So you see, for instance, what the different sizing would be, a little different depending on which strategy you pick. What you'll want to know at this point is what is the level of effort to do those 3 migration strategies. Migrating to an app service, quote, modernization, is more effort than virtual machine lift and shift versus some middle ground containerization, which is becoming more and more kind of a preferred strategy for certain kinds of applications. The migration effort, same thing here on database. What will it take to redo your storage, your current SQL environment into take advantage of Azure SQL database versus SQL just running on a VM? But if containerization is not something that you're going to think about, it is kind of optional. Certainly, the VM migration, I'll call it mass VM migration, is something you ought to think about. And as you look at that, it falls into sort of 3 kinds of activities. There's a set of pre-migration activities where you, either by yourself or with the help of an SI like Pragmatic Works, can help you think through what we call the center of excellence. Who within your organization, from security, from networking, from DevOps, those teams who will have a lot of activity once you get to the cloud and as you get to the cloud, who are those individuals? What are their skills around operating in the cloud? Pull those people together, create what we call the enterprise grade subscription, where you're going to deploy from a lift and shift standpoint these VMs as decisions are made about them, and then do a migration pilot. Take one application and their associated VMs for storage and so forth, actually deploy it, move it to that subscription, see what you learn about that environment. If you're doing it alone, what tools you want to use. If you're doing it with the help of a partner, what kind of learnings are you getting out of that you can apply in the second phase, which is kind of the mass migration approach. We call it the migration factory, because you can get into a cadence, which is why not doing this as a kind of onesie twosie approach, why that factory approach, 100, 200 VMs migration over a period of a number of weeks or months is the way to go to get it and get scale in the cloud. And then obviously report on progress. And then post-migration, which is where you start to do the fine-tuning, the optimization, and perhaps modernization as you go forward. So that's what you need to know about lift and shift. And then you follow that with data migration. When you get to the third stage, which is monitor and optimize, some of the lessons that we've learned and of course built into our tooling is having some kind of all-up view. And if you're an enterprise of any size, you may have multiple subscriptions for all kinds of reasons. You may have subscriptions with different security baselines. They could include applications that have what are called low business impact, where you have no concern around data protection, versus high business impact, where you might have applications or storage located where you need to meet the requirements, let's say, of the GDPR or HIPAA, and where you need to bring in, from a services standpoint, different Azure information protection type of service that will apply encryption to your storage. Whereas maybe in the lower business impact areas, you don't need that. But having a good view all up across all your subscriptions is important at an enterprise best practice operational level. And what you're going to want to be looking at here on an ongoing basis is how you're doing. One of the things that, and it's true of all cloud vendors, when you get that first bill, and you're looking back at your business case, you go, wait a minute, how did I get to this number? You want to have a way to look at your actual usage over a period of time, let's say last 3 months, and a way to begin to project, sort of on a pro forma basis, what you could be saving if you started to look at machines that are prod that should be DevOps. It could be spun down over a weekend. Looking at machines that are oversized. Looking at services you just don't use, but you deployed them because you thought the application might make use of it. So having a good way to look at costs is important, and then having some recommendations, ideally automated, but even if you don't use automated tools, having a way to use data that can come to you from Azure, that whether you create some spreadsheets or some other analytic capability, in addition to what you get from straight Azure management, is important. And this will be an ongoing monthly management. So that's important. Then once you've gotten past that sort of tweaking, fine-tuning, ratcheting down what could easily be another 25 or 30% optimization once you're over straight lift and shift, now you can begin to look at the areas for modernization. That could be containerized, as we just talked about. It could be refactoring and re-architecting the application. Let's say it is a mission critical system. You've got the code, but you haven't really done much with it. And now that it's running in the cloud, maybe there's some opportunity for improvement. What you need to know as you look at this is whether that application is ready for modernization. In this particular case, there's an application that was scanned recently, and the good news is only 25% of it's not really ready at the code level for that. Same thing is true in terms of what that estimate for that 25% is going to be, and in what areas, and how big is that estimated effort. You need to utilize some analysis to determine just what that modernization is going to be. And down to the code block level. This is where lots of organizations will spend lots of man hours, person hours to manually go through code, whereas a tool similar to what we have or our tool can get there very, very quickly down to the line number and have very specific recommendations for changes at the code level. You've heard me use the term baseline, and what we mean by baseline is that, as I said, there could be requirements, PCI requirements or GDPR requirements, a set of feature settings that you need to ensure that your operations group overseeing your instance or your subscription are following, because you're under some regulatory requirement as an organization. And having a way to pull in data from the Azure Security Center, that's a standard capability from Azure, into one dashboard by service and so forth. Having a way to do that is helpful. And then finally, what we've learned looking at the way people modernize or containerize their application, when there are no rules of the road for your developers, even in a DevOps environment, there needs to be some set of, at a code level, architectural level, the kinds of things you see here, whether those are being followed, and have a way to report that out. And the biggest one right now is around the world of roles-based access, that very often organizations, in their effort to move to the cloud quickly, will make everybody an owner and administrator on a subscription so they can be unimpeded in getting their jobs done, when many of those people in the organization really only need to view or some other role that's appropriate for their job function. They don't have to be an admin. And so there are very defined RBAC rules that can be applied in a DevOps rules environment. So we're coming up on the hour here. So in summary, number one point is, yes, the cloud is frequently discussed as innovation, agile, time to market kinds of things, but the fact of the matter is cost reduction is often the driver and will fund your cloud development once you're there. Start with a very thorough assessment of what you have in place. You may find that you've got some infrastructure you didn't know you had and maybe just ought to get retired. Those are data-driven discussions that you need to have. Once you know your migration approach, generally start with IaaS. There may be some containerized applications that make sense, but usually IaaS is a great way to start. Then optimize, and then modernize from there. And then I can't stress this enough. Manage your cloud environment at the resource level, not just at the subscription level, but down at the resource level, at the VM services level, because that's where, if costs start to go up, that's where you'll manage it. If security starts to go away from a baseline, that's where you'll manage it. If you're not in compliance with some set of regulations, that's where you'll manage it. So, so that's our session, and let me see if we have any questions or if the team online has captured anything. I'm not seeing anything in the chat window. So on the assumption that there are no online...
we have a couple questions.
Oh, you do? Oh, good.
Yeah.
There you are. Yes. Good. Go for it.
Okay. Someone is asking what tools you would recommend to perform the discovery process.
Great question. So the map tool does a very good job of capturing basic inventory with two, or basic discovery with two provisos. Very often map is run just looking at Microsoft technologies. It will pick up other technologies if you set it that way. It will also do a second pass around performance and gather lots of data. So some of the screenshots you saw in the background there, all of that information is available from a map discovery process. Other tools, Landsweeper, Flexera, ServiceNow, Snow, Mover, fine tools, but we think you get a lot of good insight out of the map tool.
Okay. And someone else is asking what tools you recommend for the lift and shift.
So course, I would be remiss if I didn't say Cloud Pilot does a great job of that. Our tools will provide that capability. There are other tools in the marketplace, but we've built Cloud Pilot to do both containerization and help with lift and shift.
Well, I think those are all really the only questions we have. As always, I just want to remind everybody that the recording will be available up on our site. You'll receive an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. If you have any questions that you think about later, please feel free to email us. We'll be more than happy to pass them along. Thank you, Norm and Unified Cloud, so much for presenting today. And we thank everybody else for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.